question that I'm frequently asked is, how do you go about developing a Magenta approach in your classroom? How do you go about embedding the Magenta principles? It really involves two discrete phases. You're going to begin by introducing Magenta. You're going to begin by taking a Magenta idea, an idea that you've got from a Magenta workshop, one of these video clips, an idea from one of the Magenta publications, and you're quite simply going to try it out. You're going to give it a go in your classroom. Now, the emphasis in this early stage is very much on adopting Magenta, adopting a Magenta idea. And moving into phase two, if you like, the move from introducing to developing or from introducing to embedding, really involves the move from adopting ideas to adapting ideas. The emphasis is going to switch from you taking a Magenta idea that you've got from somewhere else and you developing your own Magenta ideas. You're going to take Magenta ideas and you're going to customize them, you're going to personalize them, you're going to make them work for your classroom and your particular context. You're going to develop ideas, you're going to enhance ideas. You're just going to take things to the next level. Now, inevitably, that's going to take a little bit of time. You're moving your mindset actually from thinking about Magenta as a one-off, something that you are deliberately going to do or you're going to do occasionally, to this is just how you think. You no longer actually think about doing Magenta because it's just the way in which you teach. It's your default setting, if you like. You're developing a Magenta mindset. As I say, inevitably, that's going to take a little bit of time, but you can give the process a nudge. There's one or two things that you can do that will really help. Firstly, you could try combining Magenta ideas. Just take a couple of the Magenta principles and see if you can put them together. See what happens when you combine ideas. Take a look at these examples. The first one, which comes from a maths lesson, it's AS maths. The teacher tells me they've never encountered this particular level of maths before, and the focus is on differentiating a function to find the equation of the tangent. Essentially, it involves putting those cards in the correct order. In other words, in Magenta terminology, it's a sequence activity. It's a very good sequence activity, I have to say, a very effective sequence activity because it makes them think, it gets them talking and so on. And this example appeared back in 2014 in the original Magenta Principles book. Another maths teacher saw it, immediately liked it, but also thought about how it could be developed. Have a look at this example. Now, if you look closely, you'll notice there's actually two questions at play here. We're dividing complex numbers, and there are two questions that have been chosen by the teacher, deliberately chosen, because they are very, very similar indeed. So when a student picks up one of the cards, the first thing they have to decide is which question does it actually apply to? In other words, they have to classify the information. And having decided which cards belong with which question, they've classified the information, they've now got to solve the question, they've got to answer the questions. In other words, they've now got to sequence the information. So we move from example one, a very good example of a sequence activity, to the example that you see before you, which involves sequence and classify. In other words, we've taken two Magenta ideas, we've combined them, and in doing so, we've developed a Magenta approach, and we're beginning to nudge our understanding of Magenta that little bit further forward. Something else that you can do to develop a Magenta mindset is to always think to yourself, well, if that's what it looks like in English, what would it look like in maths or whatever you teach? Have a look at this example. You know, for all the world, it looks like a maths example, doesn't it? And yet it began life as an English lesson. It began life as a year 13 lesson, and they were studying poetry. And believe it or not, the teacher just asked the class, so what do you think the poet was doing 6 months before they wrote that poem? And what do you think they were doing the day before they wrote that poem? And what do you think they were doing a day after they wrote that poem? And what do you think they were doing 6 months after they wrote that poem? So the technique became known as before, before, after, after. And a maths teacher came across it and immediately saw how you could apply it looking at those equations that you're seeing before you. So the students are given the line of the equation and asked what would have come one line before, what would have come 2 lines before, what comes one line after, and so on. So a really good example of a teacher thinking, okay, I can't adopt that idea because I don't teach English, but how could I adapt it to my subject area? And ditto, a geography teacher saying, okay, well, if that's what it looks like in English and that's what it looks like in maths, what does it look like in geography? Have a look at this example. The students are given the diagram, the middle diagram of a sea arch and 2 pieces of paper, and they're asked if they can draw the diagram that would have come immediately before the arch and the diagram that would have come immediately after the arch. Before, after is the approach. But the mindset very much is, if it looks like that in English, what does it look like in maths? If it looks like that in maths, what does it look like in geography? And so on. So we could think in terms of different subject areas, or we could think in terms of different ages. If that's what it looks like in a secondary classroom, what would it look like in a primary classroom, or vice versa? The example you're looking at now began as an A-level lesson. It was the novel was Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and the lesson was a 2-part lesson that involved part 1. Could you select the image that best reflects, that best represents Tess's journey through the novel? Part 2, could you put the 3 images into a sequence, into order, to reflect the changing nature of Tess's journey through the novel? Fantastic lesson, really got them thinking, really got them talking. So the mindset is, if that's what it looks like in a secondary classroom, what would it look like in a primary classroom? And funnily enough, not that much different. So we used exactly the same images, and all we did was we changed the focus from Tess of the D'Urbervilles to Harry Potter. Now you've sat up and are listening, aren't you? You know the words Harry and Potter in the same sentence. Yes, I've got your attention. And the lesson simply was this: which one of those images best represents Harry Potter's journey through the 7 books? I know you're playing, and actually, it reminds me of the day in which we did it for the very first time. A boy immediately said, "It's a train, it's a train, it's a Hogwarts Express." And a young girl just turned around and said, "No, because on a train you have to go where the driver takes you, but on a bike you're free to choose where you want to go." Wow, that's a really sophisticated answer from one so young. So think to yourself, if that's what it looks like in a secondary classroom, what does it look like in a primary classroom, or vice versa? So we began with the question, how does a teacher develop a Magenta approach in their classroom? How does a teacher go about embedding the Magenta principles? And it's all about mindset. It's that mindset that says, how do I adapt this? How do I adapt this for this particular subject? How do I adapt it for this age group? How do I adapt it for these children? How do I adapt it for this particular context? It's a mindset that says, if it looks like that in maths, what does it look like in English? If it looks like that with younger children, how do I adapt it to work with older children? It's a mindset that says, if you can do it with text, can you do it with diagrams? If it looks like that with a bottom set, what would it look like with a top set? If you can do it that way around, can you do it the other way around? It's the mindset that says, how do I get them thinking? How do I get them talking? How do I make this interesting? How do I make it fun? It's the mindset that shifted from how do I teach this to how do I help them learn this? It is a journey, and inevitably it will take some time. But hopefully there are 1 or 2 ideas in this video clip that will point people in the right direction. So go play with it. The more you use Magenta, the better you understand Magenta, the better you understand Magenta, the more you use it, and all the time you're developing that Magenta mindset. So, good luck. Have fun.